Good morning. I know they're finishing up here for just a second. I am really excited to be here. This is the first time I've got to do this here in quite some time. I thought that they did all this for me because as a party this morning, we could be preaching this. It'd be one big party with all of us. But as Anita said, it's VBS week. We hope that you can come out to that. If you've got a child or grandchild, they're going to have a really good time this week at VBS. This morning, we're going to dive into one of the most faith-inspiring stories and affirming stories in the Bible, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. And so many of you, if you've grew up in church, you've probably heard a version of this story at some point in your life or got pieces and parts of it. And I love this story because there's so many applications that we could pull from it. Honestly, you could probably do a whole series just on this chapter alone. But we're going to dive into it. But before we do that, I would just like to open in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for, God, we know that you're here this morning, that you're present with us. And God, as we just look at your word this morning, help us to apply it to our lives and our hearts. And God, just look at the example that you have given us with Daniel, and then go out and live this way in our own lives. Father, we love you. Forgive us where we fail you. In Jesus' name, I pray. And so as we continue our series, Thriving in Babylon, like I said, we're in Daniel chapter 6, but it's a great reminder of God's sovereignty and his faithfulness in this book. And so throughout the first 5 chapters, you see a young man named Daniel who's taken captive, and they take him to this place called Babylon. He rises to prominence mostly because of his unwavering faith, and he's got some exceptional character about him, right? And so last week, David ended chapter 5 with Belteshazzar's death. And so at this point, at chapter 6, now Daniel is under a new reign of King Darius of Persia. And so Daniel's now getting kind of older, and he's put himself in this position of high authority. And he's done this because he's been set apart by God because of his integrity and his dedication to what he's been doing. And so what happens, though, is because he's in such a place of high authority, he starts to be the envy of his success. Other people start to envy him in his position. They don't like where he's at. And Daniel's done a lot of things correctly, a lot of the right things, made the right decisions, and he's going to continue to do this all throughout chapter 6. But he's going to face a new challenge, a challenge that many of you may have faced in the past, maybe going to face or are facing right now. And I think it's such a great reminder in our own lives of what Daniel sees here in chapter 6. And I guess that leads me to my question this morning for you. Have you ever felt like in life you've done all the right things, right? You're trying to live life the right way, or you've been in a situation where you did all the right things, and in the end, it didn't turn out the way you expected. Maybe it didn't go your way or the way you hoped for. We've all faced situations like this in our own lives. I got some examples for you. Maybe it could have been a promotion that you worked really hard for, you felt like you deserved, and you didn't end up with the job. A relationship that you kind of crafted and tailored with someone else. You worked really hard on that relationship together, and then it just didn't work out. Maybe it's a test that you studied really hard for, but you failed it anyway. A project that started but didn't get the outcome that you expected. Maybe it's you've always in your life, you try to live this healthy lifestyle, and then you go to the doctor and you receive some bad news anyway. Maybe you spent all this time on a sport in your life or some kind of goal, and maybe you expected a scholarship or something to come out of that, and the offer never came. You see, we all have stories like this in our lives. People doing great things, the right things, making good decisions, but in the end, it just doesn't work out exactly the way they had hoped. And so, this is exactly the thing that kind of happens to a guy named Ernie Banks. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Ernie Banks. Of course, when I'm up here, you're going to get a sports story most of the time. But Ernie Banks was a great player. He grew up in Dallas, Texas. I actually should have a picture of him here. This is him. Grew up in Dallas, Texas. He grew up during a time in a segregated society. So obviously he faced a lot of challenges growing up, but he kind of found some solace and peace in sports. And so he excelled in high school, basketball, football, baseball, but baseball ended up kind of being the thing that took him where he wanted to go. And so right out of high school, he gets signed on by a semi-pro team. And it didn't take long when he was on this team that he found a spot in the major leagues. And so in 1953, he's signed by the Chicago Cubs, right? And he became the Cubs' first African-American player. So he broke the color barrier for the Cubs, which is an amazing thing in itself. But then he quickly establishes himself as one of the best players in baseball. He goes on and he has this thing about him. He was known for his cheerful demeanor, his attitude. He had this saying, let's play two, because he said, I just want to keep playing baseball all day long. I love it that much. He got the nickname Mr. Cub, right? Banks is a powerful hitter, consistent shortstop, good defensive player. Like I said, a really, really good player. And this made him a fan favorite among the Cubs fans and all around through baseball. But just some of his stats here. He spanned 19 seasons all with the Cubs. All with the Cubs. He never changed teams, which is pretty rare in professional sports today. But he finished with 512 home runs, 1,600 RBIs, almost close to 300 batting average, 14 all-star teams, won a Gold Glove, back-to-back MVP. I mean, all the success as a professional athlete you could expect to have. The Cubs then, after he retired, they retired his number. They built a statue of him that still stands there today. And they said Ernie Banks was a symbol of perseverance, sportsmanship, and the joy of baseball. And so you ask any Cubs fan who their favorite player is, most of them would say Ernie Banks. Like John Henlos, who's a Cubs fan here, he would tell you Ernie Banks is probably his favorite player. But the one thing, Ernie, everybody felt like he did everything right. He worked hard. He had a great attitude. But the one thing that stands out about him, in his 19 seasons with the Cubs, he never got to play in a single postseason game. Not one. And so you think about a professional athlete, their ultimate goal would be to win a championship. And I got to think that in his mind, this would be a missing piece in his career, obviously. Never getting to play in a postseason game, let alone getting the opportunity to play in a World Series. And you think, how can someone be so successful in their profession but then never reach that ultimate goal? And so this morning, as we get to chapter 6, we see Daniel's in a very similar place in his life right now. As I said, he's very successful. He's now in his 80s, so he's getting a little bit older, and he's set himself apart compared to all these other leaders. So if you're not to chapter 6, go ahead and turn there. But we got a new ruler, Darius, and as any new ruler would, and any new king, what's he want to do? He wants to reorganize the government. So he starts out and he finds all these leaders because he wants to take control as quickly as possible. He don't want there to be any leftovers with the old reign. And so he reorganizes the government. As Joe and David have been saying, Babylon was such a massive empire that there is no way that Darius was going to be able to do this on his own. He wasn't going to be able to control the thing. So he sets out about 120 leaders, and they're kind of like governors, and they call them satraps, all right? You see that in there? And they're spread throughout the whole region, and they're kind of the chief representatives. They're the eyes and the ears, and what these guys are going to do is they're going to make sure that everybody's staying in line for the king. But the thing about this position is that these guys tended to become increasingly wealthy. They kind of took advantage of their positions a lot of times because they knew that the king couldn't oversee everything. So if they took a little bit, then they took advantage of a couple things. That's okay because King Darius, he cannot do everything himself. Now, there was one person though that did not do that, and this was this guy named Daniel. And so what verse 3 tells us about Daniel is he had this reputation of honesty and wisdom, and it uses the word distinguished. Daniel distinguished himself from the rest of the group. While Darius was already planning to make him one of the top advisors, he now was set apart, and he made him second in command, basically. So Daniel is so distinguished that he is now over all these satraps, all the leaders, and he's just right below King Darius. So his life's pretty good for Daniel, right? He's doing well for himself. What you find out, though, is that here in a minute, it kind of leads me to this first point. Even when you're doing well, a life of unwavering faith can come under attack. A life of unwavering faith can come under attack because these other leaders, they did not like Daniel being over them, all right? So let's start in verse 4, and we're going to see how they felt about Daniel being in charge. It says, at this, the administrators, the satraps, tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct against government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent, And finally the men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." And so Daniel's character is so good, they can't find any flaws in him. And so what do? They turn to his faith. And I think that there's another crucial point in this, is when you're living a life of integrity and faithfulness, right, God's going to set you apart. Whether it be in a workplace, whether it be in your family, whether it be in a community, God is going to give you the opportunity to flourish, right? But it can also attract a whole lot of opposition. People are going to try to find some fault in your character. And so it's exactly what happens to Daniel. He's living a life, he's set apart. God is using him in such an incredible way, but the leaders are working to oppose him. Why are they doing this? Maybe it's pure jealousy. Maybe it's because he was a Jewish exile. Maybe it's because he was older, right? Many of the situations that we get ourselves in, it can be that, but many resources, many people believe it was pure greed. Because now with Daniel watching over all these people, he's checking to see what's coming in, and now these satraps cannot use their positions for personal gain and personal profit, because Daniel's saying, hey, that's supposed to go to the king. Where's this, right? He's checking over all of them as they go. So what do? They got to come up with a plot to get Daniel out of here. They got to say, we got to get rid of this guy. So let's read on verse 6 and see what they come up with. It says, so the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius, may you live forever. All right? The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and force the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being for the next 30 days, except for you, King Darius, right, that your majesty, they shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now your majesty issue the decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And so what's King Darius do? He signs it, right? He signs that decree. He puts it in writing because the conspirators knew the only way to accuse Daniel would be to somehow attack him through his faith. And what better way than to manipulate King Darius, right? May you live forever, right? They flatter him. They play to his pride and all these things. And so he ends up making kind of a bad decision. They manipulate him into seeing this as, hey, nobody else needs to be praying to any god or human besides you, Darius. You're the most important. And so if anybody else is doing that, we're throwing them into the lion's den here in the next 30 days. And the people knew that this would work because they knew the type of character Daniel had, and he was not going to compromise on his commitment to God. Daniel would not compromise. And oftentimes in our society, this is how people are, like I said, they're going to use anything to break us down when you're living a life of unwavering faith. Oftentimes that's when you're going to get attacked the most by people, by Satan, is when you're living that life, doing your best, right? Any minor flaw, any chink in the armor, they're going to seek out, they're going to twist it, they're going to try to fit it to their narrative. And this is exactly what they do to Daniel. It reminds me of a thing that King David said in Psalms as he's writing in a prayer to the Lord about some of his enemies. I think I have it in the slide here. In Psalms chapter 5, it says, not a word from their mouth can be trusted. Their heart's filled with malice. Their throat is an open grave, and with their tongue they tell lies. And that's exactly what these other leaders were doing against Daniel. They were doing anything they can to get him. And so now, for us, let's go back to the application part. What do we do when we're placed in a situation similar to this? What do we do? How do we react? What would Daniel do? So some of the things I think Daniel had the option to do would be, one, he could have prayed still, right? But maybe he could have done it in secret. I mean, it's just 30 days. So he's going to pray, but he won't tell nobody, and he won't be bold in his faith like he's been. He'll just kind of keep quiet and pray to himself and to God in a quiet place. He could have quit praying for 30 days. Hey, I don't want to be caught in the next 30 days, so God will understand. I'll just quit praying. He could have gone to King Darius himself. I mean, he's high in authority. Maybe he goes to them just like the other leaders did, and he says, hey, King Darius, let's change this. What can we do? Can we write a new edict or a decree that saves me from this? And flattered him in the same type of way. But knowing Daniel, we know that he didn't do any of those things. Which leads me to a second point. Before we read the next part about what this decision Daniel made is this. When your faith is under attack, you have to stand firm. Your faith is under attack, you got to stand stand firm. As easy as it would have been for Daniel to compromise or to play to this decree that has just been sent out, he stood firm. He stood firm. And so, verse 10, jump with me there. It says, now when Daniel learned the decree had been published, so he would have known about this really quickly, being in his position, he went to his home, and to his upstairs room where the windows were open right out in public towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees, he prayed, and gave thanks to the God just as he'd done before. You see, he didn't change a thing. The Bible says he does his prayer just like he did before. And so these men, they got their binoculars out, and they're watching from across the road, I guess. I don't know what it looked like, and they're looking and saying, there's Daniel. He's over there praying. So what do? They run to the king, and they say, in kind of a questioning way about his decree, like, didn't you publish a decree just not too long ago about anyone who prays to any god or any human being besides you, that they're going to get thrown into the lion's den, right? But you see, Daniel's response to that decree was such a powerful testament about his unwavering faith, because he chooses to honor God knowing the consequences. He chooses to honor God knowing the consequences above else. And I think this is just an extraordinary example of faith and how we should be living our lives as we're ready to stand firm for it today as well. You see, we know there's consequences, right? If you're a person that believes in God and you're faithful and you know people recognize that in you, people are going to reject you. People are going to cast you out. People are going to mock you, ridicule you, right? But Daniel goes as far as saying, I'm willing to die for my faith. I'm willing to die for my faith. And that is such a powerful example from the scripture this morning. He knew his response would lead him to this lion's den, but it didn't matter anyway. You know, one of the most popular phrases working with young people and being on social media and all these things you see today, and sometimes a young person will ask, what do I need to do with my life? What should I do? How should it go? And the answer is oftentimes, just go and do what makes you happy, right? Go and do what makes you happy. And while up here, I'm not going to say we don't want you to be happy as a church, right? We do want you to live happy lives, but is that the main message? And so I Googled that up, and I said, do what makes you happy. And I have a picture here, and obviously there's a lot of websites, a lot of things out there you can go to, and there's plenty of people that's going to give you some advice about go and do what makes you happy. Obviously, there is no shortage of social media content of people that have twisted this around and made it phrases and anything you can do, right? Because that's what the world wants to sell. They say, go and do what makes you happy. But if Daniel had just wanted to be happy in his situation, he's living a good life. He's living a comfortable life. He could have sat back and been second in command, went about his business, and he's probably going to live a pretty happy life. But I think if Daniel was in this day and he had his social media account and he was going to make a post to send out there to people saying, here's where I am, here's what I believe, I think his would have looked more like this. Instead of doing more of what makes you happy, he'd probably cross that out and he'd say, do more of what honors God. Do more of what honors God. Because you see, he was always searching for a way, we know about him, of a life and ways to honor God more. And he knew that by continuing to pray in public, where everybody could see it, that was what's going to honor God the most, no matter what the circumstances was. And that is where his happiness and his joy comes from. And that is a good lesson for us, as we too should try to seek ways to live our lives in which we honor God more. So, of course, Daniel does this his same morning, noon, night, evening. And so what do the satraps do, the leaders do? They look at him, they run and tattletale. They run and tattletale to King Darius. It isn't amazing how quickly people can come together for evil things, but it's hard to get people together for good. All right? You could do a whole other sermon on that. But I imagine they look something like this when they arrive to King Darius. Yeah, this is them. They're running in. They're tattletaling. They're upset. They're pointing over here wherever Daniel's maybe at or praying at. And then as they tell him about it, and they're kind of whiny, about this, I imagine this is what King Darius looked like. Yeah, you got to have some fun with this stuff, right? So Darius is shocked in his reaction. So when they tell him what's going on, they're giddy to tell him. But Darius, the Bible actually tells us, is very upset. And it's not upset in an angry way, more of a upset in a distressed type of way, because he doesn't get angry, but rather he takes a day and he tries to find every way he can to figure out not to throw Darius in the lion's den. One, Daniel's probably become somewhat of a friend at this point to Daniel. And also, he's very valuable to King Darius and his kingdom. He's keeping everybody in line. He doesn't want to throw Daniel in this den. And so, but he's already rushed to judgment. He's already signed this edict. There is no coming back from it. And so instead of consulting Daniel in the decision, his pride gets in the way. And so now if Daniel really is praying to another God that is not Darius himself, right, who's just the king, then he had no choice to not throw him in the lion's den. And so he did. Right? Daniel gets thrown in. The scholars believe these lion dens were kind of like a place, and they had a wall in there that they could raise and lower. And so what would happen is they would raise one side, the lions would come in and they would eat on that side, maybe while somebody cleaned or whatever. So it wasn't really a den as much as a cage at a zoo is the way I kind of understood it. And so what would happen, they wouldn't feed these lions very often though. And so when these lions would be hungry and that wall raised, they knew that on the other side of that wall was food. Right? In case they needed a quick execution, they would throw these people into the den. You see, throwing Daniel into this den was a death sentence. There was no sending Daniel in with a weapon. There was no Daniel maybe fighting these lions off. No, when that wall raised, they knew food was over there waiting. This was a death sentence, sending Darius in. And so Darius, upset, says, Daniel, I hope that your God saves you. Let's see what happens in the results in verse 16. So the king gave the order. They brought Daniel in. They threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Wouldn't you like to be described as that as a believer? The God that you serve continually? Somebody knows you like that? A stone was brought in, placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of the nobles so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. There was no one coming to rescue Daniel around that kingdom, right? There was no person going to come move that stone away or come and got him out. With this seal, Daniel was in there. They wasn't going to mess with the king's seal. They returned to his palace. They spent the night. The king spent the night without eating, without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So Darius is really upset. Then at first light, he gets up out of bed. He runs over to the den, and in an anguished voice, he yells for Daniel, the servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, rescued you? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent an angel. He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed. They lifted Daniel out, and they didn't find a single injury or wound on him. Amazing story. You see, Daniel's rescue gives God the glory, and he gets God the glory. And it leads me to the third point. If you're following along this morning, is that God's power is a whole lot greater than man's authority. God's power is a whole lot greater than man's authority. You see, even though God could have rescued Daniel earlier, he could have intervened. He could have prevented him from ever going into that lion's den. The next day, you see it results in something even greater, of glory and deliverance, with King Darius himself having to pull Daniel out of that lion's den. By Daniel being brought out untouched, freed, right, the Lord received a great honor. You see, it exalted God over Darius. Basically saying God's power is greater than man's authority. Darius had the authority to bring him in there and put him in there, but God had the power to bring him out. And that was so much greater than anything else that could have happened. And so because of this, what does Darius do? He sees this great act. He sees God save Daniel. So he comes up with a new decree. We're going to finish up the chapter here. So follow along with me. So he sends this to all of Babylon. King Darius wrote to all nations, every language, all over the earth. He says, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that every part of my kingdom, people must fear and revere the God of Daniel. Remember, these decrees can't be repealed. So he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so what does Daniel do? Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the next king, the reign of Cyrus of Persia. And so the other thing, though, that you learn that I didn't read is the people that come and accuse Daniel and him, their families. It wasn't all 120, but the ones that really went to the king to start with, them and their families got thrown into the lion's den. And they didn't have the same outcome, unfortunately, that Daniel had. And it kind of is a good reminder, Proverbs 11:8 says the righteous person is rescued from trouble, but it falls on the wicked instead. And so the righteous person is rescued, the wicked falls on the wicked instead. So these people that scheme and fight and go against the faith, they end up not having a really good outcome. And so we've read the story, we've read the chapter, we're through it. It all ends with a good ending, right? We could stop right there. There's a lot of things we could take from that. Everybody lives happily ever after. God's glorified, Daniel's rescued, the bad guys are punished. Sounds like a pretty good movie, a story to me, a good ending. As we come to a close, I want to go back to this original question. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right or been doing things right, and for some reason things just didn't go your way? And you see while this story turned out well, like Daniel's story ends well. If I was in Daniel's shoes, that would have been a good outcome. But what if God had chose not to rescue Daniel? So now let's think about these things. What if that ended with Daniel in the lion's den? Would we still take the same message? What if he didn't pull him out? What if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, perished in the fire? Because we read about that a couple weeks ago. Would we look at them the same way as believers? Would we come with the same encouragement? God is going to rescue us. It doesn't matter what we do, with this most unwavering faith and deliver us just like he did with Daniel, just like he did with those other guys. Would our feelings change? Would our mindset change? I don't know about that. But I just think about that, and there's been examples of that. But I want to go back to Ernie Banks. Ernie Banks, like I said, had a tremendous career. All these things. Everybody spoke so highly of him, his attitude, his, how he played the game of baseball. He had great success. He did everything right. But I want to show you a headline from Chicago Magazine. It may be kind of difficult for you to see, talking about this guy, but it's shortly after his death in 2015. The first part is the kind of headline, and then the column wrote, and then the second part is a quote. I just want to read it to you really quickly. It said, Cubs fans remember him for his pervasive optimism, but he was far more complicated than it appeared. And toward the end, he was a lonely man, one tormented by his demons. And then the quote from Ernie says, sometimes I'm at a Hall of Fame reunion, and I look around and I see all these other guys in the room who played for a World Series. I have nightmares about it. I've talked to a psychiatrist. There wasn't much he could say, but just I'd done the best I could, and it wasn't meant to be. I wanted to show you that because from the outside world, a guy like Ernie Banks seems like he's got everything anybody would want, right? A successful career. Yeah, he didn't play in a postseason game, but he seemed happy. It says he was optimistic when he was around all these folks. But then when it comes down to the end, according to those close to him, he was lonely, and he had all kinds of demons in his life. And you go and you read the rest of that article, you can tell what's going on there, and he's struggling, right? And you look at the life of Ernie Banks, what seemed to be a guy that did everything right, but in the end, he still has his struggles. And you go back to Daniel's story, all right, he does everything right leading up to this point. He stays faithful to God. He prays, right? He stands up for his boldness and his faith. But in the end, he still gets thrown in the lion's den. And the point I want you to catch is this. Daniel did not save himself in the lion's den. He did not save himself by doing everything right. Daniel still needed a rescuer. Daniel needed God to come in and intervene and prevent him from death. And that was God's decision. That wasn't Daniel's. And so today when we examine our own lives in this world, we too can have a ton of success. We can help a lot of people. We can be good people. But in the end, we still need a rescuer. And that's what I want you to catch this morning, because if this morning you don't know that Jesus is our rescuer, then you got an opportunity to do that this morning. Because right now, when it comes for you or I to face life or death, and it doesn't come down to whether we live a successful life, a not so successful life, a happy life, a not happy life. It comes down to knowing Him and knowing that fact right there, that Jesus is our rescuer, because nobody's checking our stats. Nobody's looking back and checking that. They just want to see, God wants to see, do you have a relationship with Him? Right? Because if we don't, we're no different than the people that threw Daniel in the lion's den in the first place. Wrapping up, Hebrews chapter 11, you see this list of all the great people in the Bible. And they do all these great things. It's kind of got their accounts, and it's kind of neat to read. Then you get down to verse 36. And it talks about these people, and it don't even list them by name, who were followers of God, but the world was not worthy of them, it says. And so, unlike Daniel, when they were thrown into their lion's den, God didn't pull them out. They faced death. And what I'm saying here is, when no one knows when our time is coming. And so when we leave these doors today and we walk out of this room, you don't know when your time is coming. And my hope is that whenever you get thrown into your lion's den, right, that Jesus is there to rescue you. And maybe it's not for this life, but it's more important for the next. So this morning, if you don't know Jesus, if you want to talk more about that, you want to pray about that, we're here. David's here. Joe's up here. We'd love to talk to you, okay? Stand as they